Please welcome Nathan Bruemmer, a legal expert in education rights and a tireless advocate for LGBTQ plus students. This session will walk us through the 10 key points from the Protecting Your LGBTQ plus Child's Rights Guide, which by the way is in our resources. If you would love to look at it afterwards, you can download it. And he's going to help us understand how to advocate effectively in our schools and communities. Nathan, welcome. It's all yours.
Good morning. Yes, that was a beautiful opening, no doubt. So, and now a lawyer. No, I'll give a little bit of an introduction to my background. I'm going to share my slide here. This is the only thing that I was concerned about. I am calling you all not home from Florida. I hail from St. Pete, but I am actually in New York City at a wonderful conference. At Lavender Law, hosted by the National LGBTQ Bar Association. And I'm here with a number of colleagues um, focused very much on this very topic. So let's get the slideshow going. Aha. All right. So I think we're set. So I come with a long background, deeply rooted in education, long before becoming an attorney. Honestly, my experience in the classroom and with my own family brought me to the law. And I was fortunate to be predominantly a seventh grade science teacher in Hillsborough County, but I also taught some high school between 1909 and 2009. And as I listened to Carolyn's beautiful storytelling, I was reminded not only of my own journey in Hillsborough County Public Schools, but my daughter's journey as well. And so I'll pepper in some stories as we go through this presentation about what options exist for families. But my work in advocacy and my law practice now is I advise a number of folks in both traditional legal topics, but really focusing on LGBTQ advocacy these days is rooted in both that time in the classroom and as a parent. I'm proud to say my daughter is now grown and a parent herself. And although I brought her to work as a seventh grade science teacher, and after that experience, she told me she never understood how she um, would ever think about being a teacher, she became a teacher. So the tradition continues and the education roots are strong. As I must do as we go through some of the details, there might be individual circumstances for your family, and I have to give a disclaimer as a practicing attorney in Florida that we're talking about things from an educational standpoint. And although you may need legal advice, nothing today will be considered that. And sorry about that. Now back to our regularly scheduled program. But we'll talk about where we are today. And we're in a very different place than just a handful of years ago, and certainly in a very different place than when I started doing this work myself over 3 decades ago. But we still have best practices and we still have phenomenal humans doing great work at every level. And what we hope to bring to you all is a way to empower your family to continue to advocate for yourself and for your children and for their future as we move forward. And the school year is coming. While I'm not a K through 12 teacher anymore, I am teaching at the law school, and so I'm preparing from the instruction point of view and thinking about what my new students will bring to the table and reviewing the coursework. Interestingly enough, I'm teaching a constitutional law seminar on LGBTQ focused cases. So I'm fully immersed in the more doctrinal approach. We're not going to be real heavy on that today, but we will talk about it a little bit because the circumstances we're in today demand it. But I will say, as I sat in the room yesterday was our first day for Lavender Law. I remember first coming to this conference many years ago as a law student and joining the first Transgender Law Institute that they created to focus on specifically topics faced by the trans community. And it was a very small room. Um, the folks in this room yesterday, specifically for that institute, it was standing room only. The chairs were around every side, and a very passionate group of advocates and attorneys and judges, and the largest group of law students I'd ever seen, were participating eagerly, working on some of the standard approaches, which we'll talk about, and some of the well, what we considered new approaches, but I think some of us who have been doing the work for a while realize are really where we got our roots in how we approach um, the work that we do with schools. So we think about the traditional approach to the school year, and I remember doing this for my daughter. Depending on your circumstances, there may be a meeting with the team as you approach the school year. Some parents may have IEPs or 504 plans in place for their children, or you just may be new to the district or to the school. And when we have an LGBTQ child, we often are concerned about even additional circumstances. So, depending on the network you may have currently or what research you may have done behind the scenes, the best practices we've always talked about continue to be the best practice we'll continue to focus on and advocate. So, their nerves as parents, as family members, certainly nerves for the students, depending on the level they're in. Um, but school is coming within weeks. And the rights we have always talked about continue to be the rights for our students. And I want to really drop that in the conversation to begin with. While the challenge is how we fight for the due process to protect these rights, and while the court cases may not be where we hope they would be, these rights are still in place. Our rights for safe and affirming learning environments, our rights, our freedom of speech to be who we are, our rights to access spaces and to launch into adulthood successfully. And I know some of these have been certainly challenged and tested by the courts and by the limits of the US Constitution as it stands, but the rights themselves stand firm. It is our strategy and how we protect these rights and we preserve these rights that we are adjusting within the movement. And another reflection I will share with you all from yesterday's conversations, um, holistically and almost uniformly, and this may be surprising given the topic we're in, but the hope is, frankly, to keep the law out of our spaces, often needing to create and tether both within government structures and tether ourselves to the court systems to demand justice creates a whole other host of problems. But while the lawyers are doing the work, often there are many more of you, and certainly our families, that are doing the work behind the scenes that are getting the results as well for our families and for our students. Um, so here's the reality for today, and I've sort of hearkened on that a little bit. And I'm going to highlight some of the cases that exist because we certainly are confronted by those realities, and we have cases coming forward next year that are centered on the issues that our students are certainly facing. But it's an imperfect system, right? Our rights require we sometimes challenge the systems that are trying to take those rights away, and the way in which we're able to do that is through exercising due process. And I want to emphasize the second word there. It's a process. And I think that's where we have been challenged by the outcomes in recent years, but the protections that have been there continue to be there. Now, you wouldn't maybe know that based on some of the headlines, and I'm not going data heavy. There's a tremendous amount of research and best practices. Um, Over the years, I've certainly done quite a lot of presentations using introductory language and sort of a bit of a 101, giving a lot of data and statistics. As a parent, for me, the most important data I need is probably sitting at my kitchen table for breakfast. Um, we know what the trends are, and so I'm a bit more focused on the imposition of the headlines these days because they often are giving us just an overview and often a really inconcise and inaccurate portrayal of exactly what the circumstances are. And so when I go through some of these cases and we balance what they are and what they mean, um, I reflect often on those headlines. And I get a lot of emails from families often after a story breaks. There's the headline and then there's the question, but what does it really mean? And it sometimes takes a bit of time to understand what that means, as the nuances are getting, I think, certainly much more complicated. Um, and frankly, I often protect myself from the headlines because the pace at which we're seeing those headlines is much faster than will I ever recall, certainly in my lifetime. And I'd be remiss in my introduction to not also share with you, many of you I am sure I don't know, aside from being a teacher and a parent, and an attorney and an advocate, I'm also a transgender human. So I've confronted this myself. One of the reasons I left teaching, unfortunately, after a lot of wonderful years, was it wasn't an environment that I was allowed to stay in, or I would have been terminated. Now, this was a number of years ago, but education continues to be near and dear to my heart. And the headlines for me and for my family are challenging. And so we often start with the advocacy by turning off the TV, um, and frankly, putting the phones down as we move through things. But I have to pay attention to them because we see a lot of cases getting decided. And as additional cases get decided, we start to notice some trends. And I want to highlight these trends just a little bit because the legislative trends tend to mirror some of the litigation trends over the years. And I've researched this for a lot of years. The pace at which decisions are coming out and the sheer volume now, there are amazing websites out there. If this is something that you appreciate knowing more of, I'm a bit of an information junkie and I appreciate understanding the landscape. I'm happy to send you some resources that provide much more detailed information, but we used to be able to do the survey of this rather quickly, but across the states, of course, the overall trend has been more legislation filed than we've seen in a lot of years, and certainly in Florida. And I'm, proud as somebody that has supported this organization, Equality Florida, and been excited about the launch since we started Safe and Healthy Schools to work and partner with them. We have been very successful in our state legislation until recent years. And that trend, of course, we often recognize for Florida is the tip of the spear when we're seeing other states experience the same circumstances that we began to experience several years ago. If we look, though, at legislative and litigation trends, there's really good news there. And so it's one of the places I also want to start because we have had good decisions and we have knocked down a number of attempts to continue to legislate. And we recognize that there are boundaries, even though the political realities are what they are, um, there are boundaries, even for voters and even for legislators. And those boundaries are often based on humanity, who they know, who has been in front of them. And so I can't not mention the great work that Equality Florida does in making sure that our families get an opportunity to connect with their local, either through school board or state representatives by taking a great trip up to Tallahassee as a part of advocacy days, um, because it is effective. Those that know us, and that's one of those things that is maintained in the research, when communities know each other, when folks know someone, um, the connection in doing the advocacy is certainly deepened. Legislation and litigation, though, sometimes is done with a bit more of an anonymous approach without that, right? We often have plaintiffs in cases that have very narrow, specific parameters for their cases, and there's, often a misunderstanding about what that case really means. So let's start first with some litigation, and then I'll reflect back on some legislation. And I think the big good news that we felt hopeful from as the current Supreme Court sits is, of course, the Bostock decision, which basically gave us what we knew righteously, that sex discrimination protection certainly included sexual orientation and gender identity. The question, though, it was argued under equal protection clause parameters was, how far will it go? Where else will it apply? And some of the big questions creep into the education spaces around what that application will look like under Title IX. Other cases, though, more recently, and these are the things that have been top of mind certainly, was the Scrimeti decision that came out this session, as well as the Mahmoud v. Taylor decision. But both are a little narrower in the application, although reading both of those decisions is not was not something enjoyable. I did read it first as a human and then as an attorney and as a professor. But unfortunately, the trend of this and the implications for us as family members is to be, I think, just aware from an environmental survey standpoint where things tend to stand. And so ultimately that decision around healthcare for minors focused on age and medical diagnosis, but not on the basis of sex or transgender status. And it ultimately then, did not violate on their argument the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And the more nuanced piece, and there may be attorneys on this call, certainly attorneys are parents of LGBTQ humans as well. The deeper conversation that's happening from a doctrinal standpoint is the decision to make that on the basis of a review that was, I think, what we were not hoping for, which is referred to as a rational basis, or really the lowest level or the lowest review standard. It's interesting to notice that because of a couple of the other cases doing some interesting things as well. Um, where the next cases will go, we don't know. There are some new cases coming in that were held, and I'll highlight those in a quick second, but I want to talk a little bit about Mahmoud as well, which is really quite a narrow holding, and it speaks specifically in the educational setting. And here's the reason for the general understanding. What we have seen as a pattern, unfortunately, is folks, I think, feeling empowered by the law, um, and taking liberties with what these cases mean, even individual actors. So not even, school districts or even specific schools, but sort of choosing to make decisions. Um, and we need families and parents to be empowered as well to understand what these cases mean enough for you to advocate and know whether or not what you're hearing, or maybe as we sometimes call it, sort of the smell test, it just doesn't seem quite right, whether maybe you should seek out expert help, either in an advocacy partner, like through Equality Florida, or frankly with an attorney. Um, but the Mahmood decision was around reading material and books that were in the school and not allowing parents to have an opportunity to opt out. That we know best practices. If we're exposed to curriculum that is inclusive, the outcomes are positive, not just for LGBTQ students, but for everyone, right? So we want to see ourselves in the things that we study. And certainly I remember, and I'm still hearkening back to all those great stories from our opening speaker from the 90s, because that was my time frame as well. Um, and I had a lot of friends that had similar experiences as well. And the passive versus active exposure, while I don't agree with the arguments that were made, it's interesting to see how the decision was made by the court to give us an indication of maybe where they might go, right? So there's a bit of a warning and maybe a bit of a roadmap, all right, a little bit of a good news in a difficult decision. And the warning, when we sort of look at what the opt-out argument brought to us, and we look at if just wholeheartedly religious objections are considered bigotry without diving in a little deeper, and for many of us, we are spiritual as LGBTQ humans. Um, the ability to really honor inclusion and offer parents a way to participate is the thing that we're all looking for. And so the case focuses on parents wanting to obviously dissent from that, but it's really a roadmap for me, similar to when we talk about in a moment the Parents' Bill of Rights that we passed. Um, there's also a pathway there in arguing or advocating for your child. Um, so it's an interesting case for sure. The other piece, just from a law geek point of view, is they pulled a case back from the 70s that's quite old, which is unusual because it hasn't been cited in a long time. What it'll mean for future cases, we don't really know. But generally speaking, as more of us have talked about that case, while it impacts educational settings, and I think the prediction is folks will go further than what the case really demands, it is really quite a narrow holding, which is an interesting thing to look at from a studying perspective. Now, where are the cases going so far next year? Here's what we know. The sports cases have made it up. So we have two cases that have made it in to think about watching for next year, one at a collegiate level, one at a K through 12 level. Um, and we still have cases that we may hear get announced. And we also had a conversion therapy case that was picked up. So those are things to watch out for in the next session. The other reason to watch what the cases are is frankly to reflect back on what might likely be in the headlines. And so this is not only supporting ourselves as humans and families and what we might have our families exposed to, but it also is something important to pay attention to as far as what's on the horizon as you may need to advocate. Again, folks tend to, in this current environment, maybe pre-comply with circumstances before we really know what the law is, right? Um, I'm not getting into things like executive orders with this presentation, but the federal administration as it sits right now has been overplaying, utilizing executive orders, which are about policy setting. It's not an executive order doesn't create a new law. And when we look at, what are the systems that exist, the laws should be, really the basement or the floor for what we want from a protection standpoint. It's the last stand of what it is. We have federal, state, and then we have local laws, and we certainly have then the ability of litigation to start to sway that. And then what we have fought so hard for many, many years, and where there is still, I think, great potential are in the policies. Now, if we look at a survey of where Florida sits right now, and there are a lot of great resources out there, and I'm going to just highlight something that's available through the Movement Advancement Project. They do state profiles. It's a great short summary on where everything sits. Um, it's not good news, but it is certainly the circumstances that we have to be aware of in Florida. I appreciate the way Movement Advancement Project looks at it. First, is there a law or not? Does it exist? So is there a law to protect? Or in their review process, is there a negative law? And I leave the citation up there for you to look at. If there are other places that you're familiar with, it's really just a phenomenal resource. I think the link's been dropped in the chat as well. I would take a look. And Florida, unfortunately, is something that has hit national headlines, and not for the reasons we would want, of course, but we have a significant number of negative laws that are in place, and a number of those affecting students at every level. And we do have some protections within the child welfare system, but overall, if we look at where we sit nationally, and I know this is no surprise to anyone, although this is a newer trend in the last couple of years, MAP now has the ability to give negative grades, which as a former teacher, I didn't know that you could do that. But in fact, Florida has what's considered a negative grade. So thinking about sort of the circumstances of what that looks like for your awareness as well, we have to think about the other varieties of laws that can impact our youth. And it isn't just about the direct impacts, but I think I also want to frame this around how we're talking about LGBTQ plus families, or how we're talking about trans and non-binary youth at different ages and stages of life. Um, in some ways, it makes our job harder, but in other ways, I think it creates opportunities. I mentioned earlier when we talk about the benchmark of what got us to success with the Obergefell decision, what got us to marriage equality. When they looked at how many folks really knew somebody, who was gay or who was lesbian or who was a part of a family, you know, that is just your neighbor, your coworker, somebody who's in your family, that number, when it reached critical mass, we start to really see hearts and minds changing, and it's easier to make those policy decisions. And we have gotten there quite successfully after a lot of years of advocating. But if we look specifically to the issues challenging trans and non-binary humans right now, and for folks with family members who are trans and non-binary specifically, folks don't know as many of us. They may know celebrity names, but that percentage is much, much lower. And there's some great research put out by Williams Institute, which is another fabulous option for pulling, I think, deeper articles if you are so inclined. Um, but if you look at the way some of the legal cases have been written, the complaints, if you read the laws, if you look at the transcripts from the public hearings where we discuss and we debate these things, the way in which folks talk about us has changed. And the framing, unfortunately, has forced us to be in a bit of a reactionary position. And one of the best resources when you are self-advocating or when you're advocating for your family is you get to control the narrative from the outset in introducing your family to that environment. Um, that to me is an opportunity because again, as I just mentioned, when folks know us in unexpected places, in great circumstances, good work is happening. And I want to give that as we continue to look at the strategies and continue to talk about what the landscape looks like across the state of Florida in lots of places, big and small, in rural settings. You know, there have been phenomenal humans that have individually or even within particular schools or districts that have been willing to do what they need to do. Seeing, you know, what's on the landscape and understanding, even if they don't deeply understand by personal experience what is happening, they know that it is the right thing to do to support all children. And that's the commonality for when we think about the arguments we want to make about doing the right thing. That I think, you know, when the advocates and the lawyers and the judges were in the institute I mentioned to you all at the start of the presentation, is keeping the law out of the spaces and putting the humanity back in is that thing that I think um, will make the biggest difference after all. Now, the details, of course, will get played out in the court systems, but until then, we have to continue to work with each other. So, where are we at with rights and laws as we sit? So, we have federal protections that I want to talk about a little bit, and we still have the same options we've always had. So, Title IX is interpreted, we think, conclusively. We're going to continue to focus on what that guidance can mean. And there are opportunities, certainly under First Amendment. Students have privacy rights through FERPA, which is a fabulous acronym. Um, but in essence, you know, if you need to update records, that's an option. There are a number of other claims that have been made around whether or not somebody has faced discrimination. But your local resource, that school will always be the first place you go, right? So we've got Florida laws as well that are impacting the circumstances today, but they will also be continuing. We expect to bring forward some new laws, and we'll continue to fight those down. Now, the good news, last cycle, every law that came forward by the Florida legislature through the great work of community and citizen advocates and great partners at organizations all over the state, we knocked down all of the things that they brought forward. But more importantly, we told our stories. And that juxtaposition of the humanity against really where they're trying to take things, I think was ultimately the difference. So the laws are what they are, and they're not changing. And we all have those rights, and we continue to have those rights. Now, we have, and I don't have the full list, and I know the great folks at Safe and Healthy Schools are continuing to do good work, but we have a number of districts that still have resource guides that you can work with to partner on exactly how to get the most available supports for your student in the environment you're in. And so I can't possibly, over 67 counties we have in Florida, speak to them all. The school districts I know most are those in my backyard. I taught in Hillsborough County Public Schools, and I'm located in Pinellas now. But I would always encourage to considering what the pathway is. Some of the school districts or some of the partner organizations, the teachers unions have great resources still available. The federal government, I will say, in trying to make civil rights complaints, there have been some court decisions that have forced them to put back up resources they took down. So some of the standard things that used to exist as resources to say, hey, how do I file a Title IX complaint, or when should I do that? How do I file, you know, through any of the state agencies? the first thing they have done, unfortunately, is take down the information to help you in some cases. But HHS, for example, was ordered by a judge in one case to put the page back up. So there are still materials available out there. If you go to the hhs.gov website, to their Office of Civil Rights, there'll be all the LGBTQ resources that we used to have. And down at the bottom is a very specific note summarized, basically says the current administration doesn't support what's on the page. That's the gentle explanation. That the words themselves are much more aggressive in their framing, but it's making the ability, I think, for most average folks to think about, well, what is the process I can take, a little bit more complicated. And so, unfortunately, depending on your county, we'd have to look at, if you think there's been a violation, I would say first trust your gut, and then we can talk about what resources you may need, either through support through partner organizations like Equality Florida, or potentially if you think it's serious enough to review with an attorney. But we will certainly keep up when we get through the next session if there are any additional laws. A number of these cases have gone through the courts. Unfortunately, Florida's circuit, as it feeds up around, our 11th circuit is typically known nationally by most attorneys as not being the most favorable circuit to work cases up through to the Supreme Court. We share the 11th circuit with Alabama and Georgia. Florida itself has three federal districts where you could file cases: the northern, the middle, and the southern district. Um, and there are other circumstances that, there could be state claims, and we have some great partners that have done work there in trying to bring challenges that could work. We've won some arguments in unique ways where other states haven't, but it's a highly debated topic right now, unfortunately. And so the choice to litigate something is one of those options. And we can say with confidence, we know we have constitutional protections, but whether rubber really meets the road is in that moment for your child. How are they being treated? And when they come home from school, what is that experience like? And from a lawyer perspective, unfortunately, the legal process can also often be remarkably slow, which is not the answer I wish I had to give as a parent, certainly, and certainly as a lawyer. What Title IX does cover, and what we know, and where we sit right now, is it's in flux. We know it protects sex-based discrimination in federally funded programs, and we also know where the DOJ sits under this administration. They reversed positions on every matter that was coming before them, and then they pulled back guidance, and they continue to make the policy positions remarkably clear. It's not to say that folks aren't choosing to move forward with Title IX complaints. But there's an overwhelming feeling right now of this moment sort of being in flux, and a bit of a wait and see to see where some of these decisions actually go as we go forward. It doesn't mean the protections aren't there. It's more about the nuance of how your particular case should proceed, if at all. So when we talk about the tools, you can certainly file, some things legally. We can do advocacy there, and there are a tremendous number of tactics we can look at taking, but each family is going to holistically have to decide on, I think, the best approaches for what might work. But these things are still available to do, and I encourage them all. I don't think there's any one fix that is the right approach, or any one strategy that may be the right strategy. There's a lot to be said about being a part of community action, where you go to a rally or you attend a school board meeting, um, and stand up. And we've seen so many families go together, and we've seen so many students present, and it's quite powerful. The question often is, how quickly will the result come through? And the answer is, we don't often know. We've seen school boards make good decisions, and we've seen school boards make decisions less supportive of our LGBTQ students, decisions we may not agree with. But we've certainly seen folks turn out and continue to keep that in the dialogue, and we're not letting our foot off the gas on that, and I don't think we should. So what do you do? The question I think when I said earlier about looking at the headlines, as somebody who not only was in the classroom but also spent time running an LGBTQ youth center, and I'm not a mental health expert, but I've had to partner with many folks over many years. Some of the folks that are doing the great work at Equality Florida, indeed. And the hyper focus right now, forced by the media, and then I think the necessity for family members requires us to do a little bit more homework to get to at least a place that we are grounded in what the reality is, and we also as humans feel motivated to continue to doing something. And so I would encourage you to stay attuned to that, but for your unique circumstance, finding the right experts is going to be important. And I've given a little bit of an environmental survey, but again, your where you live very much relates to what protections may be in place and how comfortable you may be to approach a particular administrator or what kind of conversation you may have with a particular teacher. Um, that is a risk analysis that every family has to do when deciding, is the advocacy options or are the legal option the better options? And I would say consider the bigger question about what your goal is. There are big goals, of course, and then there are those short-term goals about what the experience is going to be like this week, this month, this school year. What are the opportunities that are presenting themselves, and consider all the options. We've had a lot of folks make academic setting changes, or school changes, district changes. Um, there are a lot of different options for how to pursue that. Sometimes it's even just a classroom setting, it's just a personality for that particular instructor if there is not more that can be done. But strong parents that advocate strongly, it is something that I certainly never apologized for. Um, but it is important ultimately to make a plan and to continue that feedback loop about what that might look like in considering different options. And frankly, don't not ask. All the things that are there are available, and one should certainly ask. I will say I flinch sometimes. I want to empower parents and families to know the law and be comfortable and confident in the law. And you could certainly cite cases, but really finding those common shared values with what the school system and what the district or what your administrator is trying to do, you are ultimately on the same page. It is just the method in which you're going to get there, and seeking out those partnerships in making those plans together within the parameters that they might be given from their district or from their general counsel. um, there are even great, school board or school administration attorneys sort of recognizing ultimately, parents have great authority in these things, and the power of even the Parents' Bill of Rights, as much as it's been a challenge, also has created some unique opportunities for parents of LGBTQ students to advocate for their own children. And so we want to encourage you to continue to do that as well. So I want to go a little bit into the risk analysis, not to discourage, but just to be, frank about how these things might work. The benefits could really be many. And when we think about other great movements and what all the options were like, I think it's the combination of the benefits that make it essential that we consider all of the things that we can possibly do. Doesn't mean every family does all these things. The advocacy organizations may do that. Local community may do that, but we do have to consider what those impacts might be. And it's a wholly unique decision for your family about what that looks like. And I think now the risk analysis is certainly more complicated, but the rewards and the benefits are as critical as ever. And so we have to have those conversations. And if you seek advice from an attorney, and you can certainly seek advice from multiple attorneys, I think you will find sometimes that advice aligns and intersects in most spaces, but sometimes um, the legal analysis or the approach might deviate ever so slightly. And as you would for any serious diagnosis in a health crisis, you might seek multiple opinions. I don't discourage you from seeking a variety of legal opinions about how to approach things either. Folks who are litigators, have very much a focus on the case and the analysis of the case. And so they're going to be in that lane, very much focused on that lane. Other folks that have more of an advocacy based approach may make those recommendations, but it's your job to do the analysis on all fronts. I've spent time in all of these spaces, and it's the reason, for my bringing this approach to you. And 100%, I've made referrals. I'm not personally litigating, but I've made a tremendous number of referrals to folks, and some folks have had great success. Sometimes just the threat of litigation is enough for a negotiation process to happen, but that does create an adversarial response. And so if the legal options get pushed and you are staying within the same environment, within the same school setting, sometimes that can create, of course, some different challenges. So that's why I go back to ultimately what is the goal and what is the hope, and what are those other options before you get to the legal option that you might consider doing. So obviously, the most important thing is to love and support our kiddos. And I think the second, I know it may be trickier, but continuing to engage with educators who understand, and certainly there are folks that are a member of our community that are educators that are at every level, all the way up to administrative and district level folks. Continue to consider your options. And I think the most lawyerly thing I could encourage you to do is document everything. You keep your options open by at least keeping track of the things that are happening. So you have a right to get copies of public records. If you're not sure if something is off or not, at least write it down. And the best time to do it is to write it down right after it happens. Um, Summarizing it, when I make referrals for folks who want to consider what their options are, it's one of the first things that is easiest to then take to a litigator to say, or if you want to just write a letter or an email, you write down the facts and what happened, and we need to maybe take some time to process the emotions of it first and put that aside, and then think about, how you should approach it. And I will always support building community, whether that's participating in great programs like Parenting with Pride or just a parent group, a support group through a local LGBTQ nonprofit that might exist in your community, or even the online communities that exist. The variety of circumstances that we could talk about in everybody's experiences just on this particular call today, you can learn from one another. I caution, though, that every circumstance is unique, but there's a lot to learn about. Oh, have you tried this? And a lot of good progress gets done. And then I would encourage that you make a plan, only if to make sure you revisit that plan if something significant changes. Um, Sometimes things can certainly come out of left field, and you may have to make a different decision than the one you decided on because you've set these are the boundaries for our family if we need to go to plan B or plan C. Um, and it may even be making a plan with your kiddos. Um, we've spent a lot more time in community and the outreach that I do, um, broadly, even with adult communities. There's been a lot more discussion around safety plans. Um, And if you have not heard about safety plans, then I encourage you to continue and lean in with the folks at Equality Florida that certainly have some additional resources, and I can share additional resources. But what do you do if you're in a situation? And that's something we've certainly had to talk about much more often, because if the policies change and if either students or even adults in settings that should be keeping our children safe are making your kiddo feel unsafe, then they have to be prepared for that. Obviously, based on their unique circumstances and your family's goals and values, but making a plan is critical. There are way more resources that I could provide. I could give you just a presentation with dozens and dozens of slides. If you need those, I'm certainly happy to provide those, and I know Quality Florida has a tremendous number of resources. But what I will say is this: national, state, and local organizations in a lot of places, and Florida is one of them, certainly have been very busy with the work. Some of our national partners who are our legal partners have unfortunately reduced staff size and are certainly testing their capacity limits. But I don't say that to discourage you from referring or reaching out to them. I encourage that. I just want to balance that with maybe some patience and grace because I know as folks have reached out, sometimes their return time has been a little slower than in prior years, but they're still doing phenomenal at work. So um, continue to reach out and consider whether you might seek your own representation. And I might say in this climate today, you seek it earlier than later, because if you're unsure and you want to set a proactive plan in place just to keep your options open, then you may want to do that. And I'm always going to support our mental health resources, our education resources. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the funding cut to 988, so I of course, list the other lifelines that exist for us to continue to support folks, and I want to encourage those.